Okay. Should be working. Excellent, it says. Let's hit this here as well. And, oh, yeah. Just kind of getting some stuff out in here. Let's see here. Go to this broadcast here first. Well, that's just ducky. Okay, let's just do it. Nobody's watching anyway. It doesn't matter. Really odd. All right, so everything looks good. Let's take a peek here. 6,000 bits. Everything's good. That looks good. Go to my studio dashboard if it lets me. Never does, of course. I don't understand how to do this or how to make this work. I'm never, ever probably going to understand how to do this. All right, we'll just kill this here. All right, that's what we got here. There's just a ton of, there's just a ton of concern. There's a ton of worry, and I, as a kind of, as I view myself as an outsider, I kind of look at the Trump win and I go, okay, well, I come at this thing from the right. I come at this thing as with more conservative views, but with a libertarian ideology behind it. And so what I look at here is I'm watching Trump kind of put together his administration. That's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on. That's what I think is important. What is Trump going to do with his administration? Because there's this thing, I think, amongst Trump supporters where they kind of, I've been saying this all through the campaign, all this incredible excitement over Donald Trump from Republicans. And I go, well, he didn't do any of this stuff that he's telling you he's going to do in terms of shrinking the government, in terms of all these promises he's making. He didn't do any of this stuff last time around. I had libertarians saying he's the most libertarian president and all this stuff. And I'm like, well, he didn't do anything that I, as a conservative, I know the Democrats are going to disagree with, that I, not as a conservative, but as a libertarian, would say this is what I'd like to see Trump do. I want to see a smaller government. I want to see lower taxes. I want to see less spending. I want to see, he did do a nice job with military adventurism. I'll give him credit where credit's due there. This wasn't a guy who opposed lockdowns. This wasn't a guy who, this is a guy who passed bump stock bans. This is a guy who's spoken out in favor of red flag laws. So there's a lot of stuff about Donald Trump where I go, I don't understand why Republicans view him kind of as this, almost as this savior type figure. But that being said, I look at him and I say, well, he's the outsider. There's not a question here from my perspective. There's not a question that Donald Trump is the outsider. I look at, as the election ran on, I started looking at who's supporting who here, who's in favor, who's backing Trump and who's backing Kamala Harris. And I had this conversation with a Democrat friend of mine, and I said, how are you happy? How are any Democrats happy that the Cheneys are backing Kamala Harris, that all these establishment neocon Republicans are coming out in favor of Kamala Harris, right? Which to me says she's the one who's going to be friendly to the military industrial complex. She's the one who's going to keep buttering that bread. I mean, it's the Cheneys, for God's sakes. And then on the flip side of it, who's backing Donald Trump? Who's around him? Tulsi Gabbard, pretty well-known, outspoken opponent of military adventurism. RFK Jr., a guy who firmly stands against the pharmaceutical interests. And I'm like, if let's erase all Donald Trump just for the sake of these next couple of sentences. If you're we've got to tear down the structure, this oligarchy, this oppressive, racist, whatever society that we're living in, and you look at who's backing who in this race, you would say, well, everything else set aside, you would say, well, I guess I got to vote for Donald Trump. That, to me, based on who's around them, you got to look at it and say, well, this is the guy we should probably be backing. And when I say we, I mean, Democrats. Just take the R&D from in front of their names, take away his first 4 years, just look who's around both these candidates. And I see the war machine around Kamala Harris, and I don't see that around Donald Trump. In fact, I see the war machine really opposing him. So it was interesting when I had this conversation with the Democrat. I'm like, what makes you keep backing Kamala Harris in light of who is in her corner? And it felt like Kamala Harris started to more and more she started to look like what I think a lot of people were saying she was, which is like a puppet to the powers that be, a puppet to these entrenched interests that have been actively working against the best interests of the American people who have been involved in starting wars that have resulted in the deaths of, millions of people. These are the people who are on her side and who are vehemently opposing Donald Trump. And I'm like, hey, my number one issue in this election was peace. I want the Middle East I want peace in the Middle East. I want the war with Russia and Ukraine to stop. That's my number one issue. And when I looked at these two candidates, I thought, if I had to back one of those horses, that's probably the guy that I am going to back. I don't know that I don't know how you could look at it any other way from that perspective. But then you can't take Donald Trump in a vacuum. You can't separate him from his rhetoric. You can't separate him from his past. You can't separate him from all the things that are going on in the public eye with Donald Trump. So you have to, at least to some extent, be honest about who this guy is. This is not a guy of high moral character. This is not really, I don't think this is not really a good person. But so when I say that I am cautiously optimistic, because I don't think there's anything else you can be at this point, you have to just be cautiously optimistic. You have to say, okay, who is this guy going to surround himself with? Who is this guy who are his cabinet members going to be? And Dave Smith was on Joe Rogan, and he was talking about this. And he said Mike Pompeo was being considered as his, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, one of those two roles. And I was like, here we go. If he starts appointing the same old people and does the same thing he did in his last presidency, then we're not going to get anywhere near what we want to be. So the very next day, when he said Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo are not going to be welcome in his cabinet, he didn't say it that brutally, but for lack of, for brevity's sake, he just said these people are not going to be involved in my cabinet. I said, okay, well, that's good. So I'm really, at this point with Donald Trump, for me, it's not necessarily about the president himself. It's about who he's going to surround himself with. And so I'm waiting and watching to see, who is this man going to surround himself with? Who are going to be the people who are feeding him ideas? Who are the people who are going to be telling him, who's he going to appoint? What's his cabinet going to look like? Because from my perspective, I do want secure borders. I don't think that a lot of Americans support the open border policies of the Biden administration. I just don't think they do. And I think you saw that play out. I mean, you had a border county in Texas go for Donald Trump that has not gone for a Republican since I think the 1930s or some crazy statistic like that. I think the gains that you saw in places that he lost, kind of the same, was that same sentiment. I think the borders were I think that was the bigger issue. I said this throughout the entire campaign, that the open border policy of the Democrats was to them what overturning Roe versus Wade was to the Republicans in the 22 midterms. It was just an anchor around their neck that they could not get rid of. And I think because of that, I think enough people put that issue above the pro-choice issue. And I also think that but obviously the economy played a major role in it, but I don't know that. And I said this, I've said this multiple times. I don't know that I lay the blame for it. I don't think it's fair to lay the blame for inflation at Joe Biden's feet. I don't, there's certainly things he did that didn't help. Still runaway spending, some of the energy policies and things like that didn't help. But when you look at from a structural perspective, we've been spending trillions of dollars more than we're taking in for a long, long, long time. And Trump was no better with that than the Democrats were. So I don't lay the blame for all the inflation at Joe Biden's feet or the Democrats' feet. I think that, and I think a lot of people would say the same. Just, anecdotally, the conversations that I had, it wasn't like everybody's like, well, inflation is Joe Biden's fault. Most people would say, well, this is a structural issue. But to me, that goes back to the outsider perspective. It goes back to the fact that if it's a structural issue being perpetrated by or propagated by entrenched interests, well, then if you're going to vote for one of these two candidates and hope that one of them blows that up, well, then Trump's the guy that you're going to vote for. If you hope that that's going to come to an end, or you're hoping that that's not going to be how we proceed, then based on who was around him and who was backing him and who was opposing him, you would say, okay, Kamala Harris represents a maintenance of the status quo and Donald Trump represents a break from that. And I'll go back and I'll say it again. There's no evidence of that from his first presidency other than the fact that he was the first president in a long time where we didn't have like new global conflicts breaking out. So outside of that, you didn't look at Donald Trump's prior presidency and go, oh, this guy's going to shrink the size of the federal government. And he's going to do all these great things from a libertarian perspective again. And so, again, I just had to go with, I didn't vote for him, in case anybody's wondering. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I live in South Carolina. I voted third party because I knew South Carolina was going, but I can say that if I lived in a swing state, would I have voted for him and advocated for him? Just to be completely honest, yeah, I probably would have. I probably would have advocated for him. I probably would have voted for him. I believe that we need third parties to be stronger in this country, and given an opportunity living in a deep red state like I do, I voted for Donald Trump or for a third party candidate. But setting all that aside for a second and moving forward. So we look at, okay, I want secure borders. I want that. I believe in that. And that's a break that I have with the Libertarian Party. It's why I'm more of a small L libertarian than a active Libertarian Party member anymore. So I do want secure borders, but I don't think that mass deportation is, I don't know what the scale of this mass deportation is going to look like. I think that concerns me. What is the scale of this thing going to be? What are we going to deport here? 1 million people? 10 million? 15 million? What? Give me some parameters. Maybe in the comment section, I could see what people are, if there's somebody who's a little bit more dialed into what his exact plans are or kind of what he's said about mass deportation, I'd love to hear it because I have grave concerns. He's talked about the U.S. military being involved. There's a lot of authoritarian, scary, expanding the police state stuff that comes out of that. On the flip side of that, you have how many millions of people who are no status in the United States who are not here legally. And this is a burden. It is a burden on the system. It is a burden on our, on public works. It's a burden on the taxpayer. And I'm not talking about immigrants who come here to work, but a lot of these asylum seekers aren't. That's the problem with the kind of like the handouts is they're not required. What are they working? What working? They're getting debit cards and they're getting free hotel rooms. So they're not in that aspect. And I don't know what those numbers are. They're not active contributors to our economy. They're just a drain. And so, yeah, some of these people probably do need to leave the country, but I have grave concerns about the use of presidential powers to execute a mass deportation along these lines. Now, I didn't look up the numbers before I got on here, and I probably should have, but they used to call Barack Obama was the deporter in chief. He deported a ton of people under his presidency. I think more than any president in history. And under Barack Obama, he had pretty secure borders. He sent the National Guard to the southern border. People don't remember this because Republicans don't want to talk about it, and neither do Democrats, because it blows up a narrative. It blows up a narrative of Democrats being weak on the border. It blows up the narrative from the Democrats of a immigrant friendly policy, but Barack Obama had strong borders and was pretty strong on deportations during his presidency. I think most people know that. Most people who are tuned into politics kind of know that, but I think a lot of just in the general public, people aren't aware of that. So is it going to be that style of deportation where it's targeted, where it makes sense, where we're going to prioritize criminals, people who've broken the law, and then, we're going to move through the process of people who, and I mean, broken the law since they've entered the country. And then are we going to move on to people who are here completely undocumented, who don't have any kind of a legal status, in the country, and we're going to move on to them. And then we're going to sort other things out. So the secure border part, I like. Mass deportation stuff scares me a little bit. So that's why I put these questions up here, is I'm kind of like, where are we going to land? What is this presidency going to look like? The next thing, and I'm seeing the memes already of the Handmaid's Tale. We're going to be living in Gilead and all these different things. For those of you who haven't seen Handmaid's Tale, I would strongly recommend reading Margaret Atwood's incredible book, Handmaid's Tale, first, and then watching the series on Hulu. It's really good, and it's really well done. And I think the first 2 or 3 seasons really stayed true to the book. Then they kind of ran out of source material and went off the rails a little bit. But here's where I have some troubles. So there are very few states, but they are out there that have passed some real draconian, what I would call draconian, no exception type abortion bans. I don't know what TikTok's going to do to me for saying that word, but there's some pretty draconian stuff happening out there. I am what you would call a very weak pro-choicer. I do believe that human life begins at conception, but I don't think we can grant personhood to the unborn, because that, to me, can lead down some pretty dark paths, right? And so if you have to weigh the rights of a fully recognized person who the Constitution recognized, people who are born or naturalized in the United States, those are the people who have rights. Is there a consciousness? And then there's all these like theological questions and scientific questions about it. I believe human life begins at conception. I don't know that it's a person. I don't know that a small multicellular organism with no, central nervous system, needs to have their rights supersede the rights of a fully developed human being. That being said, I have fears of personhood being granted to the unborn, because that opens up all kinds of draconian measures for women who become pregnant. That to me is very scary, but I think the pro-choice argument is a pretty bad argument, because for the most part, they're just dismissing the humanity of the unborn. And I think that if we can acknowledge the humanity of the unborn and the value of childbirth and propagating our species and all that stuff, that we should probably be making the decisions about that choice in a much more serious manner than we are right now, as opposed to just dismissing it. Oh, it's not life, it's just a clump of cells. I think that's a terrible, stupid, non-scientific argument from the party of science, by the way. So where's that balance? And I think that balance is to have much more serious conversations around it. But more importantly, I think that there are steps we can take to prevent and ultimately, when it comes to that particular issue, the goal to me isn't necessarily to ban anything. The government role in that, as a libertarian, I don't think that you can force one human being to grow another human being inside their body against their will. I just don't understand how you can reconcile that with the principles of liberty. But I think there's a lot of things we can do to prevent unwanted pregnancy in this country. More comprehensive sex education, particularly in regards to contraception. I think that women should be able to get birth control over the counter. Just like a man buying a condom, that doesn't mean I think women shouldn't go see a doctor and get a proper recommendation for what kind of birth control suits them best. That they shouldn't consult with a doctor, but I don't think they should have to get a prescription in order to go and get that. They should be able to buy it over the counter. Do I think a 16 or 17-year-old girl should be able to have access to birth control without her parents signing off on it? I think birth control, is probably one of those things that we just have to make readily available. And I think if we moved in that direction where there was more freedom on that side of it, that you would have far less unwanted pregnancies. We also look at the end of the day, I don't think you have to have a great deal of religious beliefs in order to say living a more living a more traditionally moral life is probably a pretty freaking good idea. This trend of encouraging promiscuity and things that's not healthy and it's not helpful to young men or young women. Does that mean I think we should be teaching the Bible in school and put the 10 Commandments on the wall and all that kind of stuff? No, but I don't think that it's a stretch to say, hey, let's do a better job educating our kids about the consequences of a promiscuous lifestyle. There's a lot of stuff out there, right? It's not just about pregnancy. It's about STDs. It's about self-esteem. There's a lot of problems with engaging in those kinds of activities before your brain is fully developed. I got beat up in here once about libertarians and their stupid age of consent conversations. Another reason I'm not a big L libertarian. For me, I'm like, if you're going to talk about age of consent, then we just need to raise the age of consent to like 21 to 25 years old. That's when you could buy cigarettes. That's when you could buy beer. That's when you could consent. So that to me, that makes perfect sense. But I don't know. I don't think a lot of young people would. I don't think a lot of young people would agree with me on that. But I guess what I'm saying is that there are steps we can take as a society that would alleviate a lot of the stress on this issue. And the other thing I would say about it is this. I watched and I'm going to do a video on this tomorrow that's going to go here and on both platforms. I'm on YouTube and here on TikTok. I said YouTube, so now probably nobody's going to see my live, but where this guy, he's talking about the access to reproductive health, whatever. They always shroud their pro-choice unaliving under these like other terms, reproductive health care and all that kind of stuff. That's fine, whatever. But the example he used, it just drives me nuts. He's like, you have a 16-year-old, 17-year-old poor black girl. I'm like, why do we have to construct it in that way? Why do we have to construct it in the guise of race? And I'm going to say a couple of things here on that. First, more poor white girls are getting pregnant, not per capita, not, as proportionally, but are getting pregnant. This is not a black issue. And the fact that abortion is so disproportionately practiced in the black community should give everyone pause. Okay. And when you look at the proportions and you look at the numbers, I asked a friend of mine this once and I said, if you look at title loans and cash check cashing places and liquor stores, and you say the placement of these things is predatory, I would say, well, let's do a map. Let's do a diagram. Let's map out the United States and look at the proximity of Planned Parenthood facilities to those exact things. If they're predatory because they're predominantly located in low income minority neighborhoods, are they not also doesn't that apply universally? That's, to me, it's a serious problem when we talk about mass incarceration of African Americans and the disproportionate impact on some of our a lot of our laws, particularly the war on drugs, on minority communities. Okay, fair enough. We should take a look at that. Why don't we ever talk about the disproportionate impact of Planned Parenthood and the African American community and minority communities? Why don't we ever talk about that? To me, why is that not a talking point? I think it should be a talking point amongst Democrats and Republicans. It should be an issue. If we're going to talk about disproportionate impact of predatory lending, disproportionate impact of our drug laws, shouldn't we let's talk about disproportionate impact across the entire, across our societal structure. The fact that I believe, don't quote me on these numbers, I've read them, but it's been a while, that something like despite women, black women making up something like, in proportion with the men, something like 13% of the population or something like that, representing 30 to 40% of all abortions in this country. Well, should we be talking about that disproportionate impact? And what does the black population look like in this country? And what does their representation look like if that wasn't happening? So it's an interesting thing. And I just don't ever hear anybody talking about it. Socket Rise. I'm wondering where they buried everyone who starved to death when egg prices went up. Come on, man. That's a good one. So that's I don't understand that. To me, that should be something that's at least worth taking a look at. Or shouldn't that be in our discussion? And then, of course, there's what everybody really voted on, which is the economy. And are we going to have economic prosperity or a brutal trade war? I think that we're doing a little pacing and leading here. I think that Trump's threats on the tariffs are something that's more designed to be a negotiating tactic than an actual something he's actually going to implement. I hope it is. I think that slapping those kinds of tariffs on, within the first 100 days of his presidency is going to hurt a lot of people. I think that he has to get, really, if you're going to look at tariffs, you're going to have to look at getting a lot of his other economic things passed. And the reason for that is because there's an offset, right? Tariffs are inflationary. It's not a question. I don't understand why I have to why I have to argue with Republicans who understand clearly that the corporate tax rate, that taxing corporations is a pass-through expense to consumers, and consumers pay all corporate taxes. But they don't understand that the same thing applies to tariffs. And by the way, vice versa, why do I have to argue with Democrats who don't think that the corporate tax rate is a tax on consumers, but they understand that tariffs are a tax on consumers? And if you want to see a great example of ideological lock in this country, that's a great example of it, where my guy says tariffs are good, so I'm going to defend them in the face of all economic analysis. And whereas if you're a Democrat, you're going to say, my people say that we should tax corporations more, but the tariff is going to raise prices for consumers. Guess what, guys? Everybody's right here. Corporate taxes make things more expensive for you, just like tariffs will. It's a tax on production and distribution. That's it. That's all it is. I'm making things more expensive. I'm making it more expensive to produce and distribute goods. That's what tariffs do. That's what the corporate tax does. There's not a difference. And if you're defending raising corporate taxes while saying tariffs are going to make things more expensive, you have ideological lock. And if you are saying that tariffs aren't going to raise prices for consumers, but corporate taxes do, and we should reduce corporate taxes and deregulate the economy, then you have ideological lock. So Trump has some good ideas. He has some bad ideas. A 10% cap on credit cards, a cap of 10% on credit card interest rates is a terrible, terrible idea. It's a bit of economic populism. And it sounds good to some people, but what's going to happen if you cap interest rates are risk-based. If you cap interest rates on credit cards, you're just going to take away that avenue of finance from people with low incomes and bad credit scores. That's all you're going to do. They're just going to lose that form of borrowing, and they're going to have to revert to even worse forms of borrowing, because if they need the money, they need the money. So if you have, a poor credit score and you're a low income person, and you think, hey, but I can get this, with my 610 credit score, I can still go get a credit card. Yeah, the interest is 25%, but I got to put a new transmission in my car and I can't afford to do it any other way. I'm going to go get a credit card. That's great. But the problem is, if you cap interest rates at 10%, that 610 credit score is not going to get a credit card anymore. That option is going to be off the table. So now when they have to go get a new transmission or replace their refrigerator in their house, or some emergency expense comes up that they can't cover because they're living paycheck to paycheck, they're going to have no choice but to go down to the local check cashing place and cash a check. So a 10%, capping interest rates on credit cards sounds really good, but it's actually a really, really bad idea, because you're just going to dry up that source. If you put in price controls, and this is the other thing. So it's a form of price controls, right? We're putting a price on lending. It's the same thing with anti-price gouging, especially saying that we're going to go after, I don't even know. They never really defined, when Kamala Harris talked about price gouging when it came to groceries. She never really defined who in the supply chain she was going to go after. And it's like, okay, you're going to stop price gouging on groceries. That's part of your platform. Okay, well, who in the food supply chain are you going after? Are you going after the farmers? Are you going after the truckers? Are you going after the grocery stores? Are you going after General Mills? All of these industries live on relatively narrow margins. So I don't know who you're going to squeeze there to bring down grocery prices. And I'll tell you something else. I like the idea that RFK is going to go and to the FDA and he's going to talk about all these poisonous ingredients in our food. He's going to try and make America healthy again. I think that's a great platform to run on. I think that corporations have had runaway control over the FDA and have put all kinds of horrible, poisonous, terrible ingredients in our food. I think we all recognize that our food supply isn't clean. But here's the problem. Well, that's going to take a lot of adjustment to the production and distribution of food. And some people rely on these ultra processed foods to get their necessary calories, sad as it may be. So how are we going to implement these things? So there's a lot of stuff with Trump that I'm kind of optimistic about. There's also some things that concern me a great deal. And so I think this idea that it's all going to go great, it's all going to go so smooth, and we got Trump back, and I'm like, let's just as a nation, let's try and be cautiously optimistic, because even if you're a Democrat and if pro-choice is at the absolute top of your priority list, fine, I get it. I don't really get it. Hundreds of thousands of people dying in wars all over the place, but okay, fine. Pro-choice is at the top of your list. Well, that's what it is, and that's back to the states. My hope would be that there's not going to be an attempt to pass some kind of a national ban. And I think if a national ban got passed, I don't think Trump would sign it. And even if he did, I think it would get shot down by the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, a conservative court, is relatively anti-federalist, and the Constitution's silent on it. So I don't think we have to worry about a national ban. There are a few states that have draconian laws, but most states haven't put any restrictions in place that would have been in violation of Roe versus Wade to begin with, because Roe versus Wade wasn't absolute protection. So again, as a nation, even as a Democrat, even as somebody on the left, there should be some things here that you should look at Donald Trump's prior presidency and kind of the things he's talking about now and go, hey, this stuff isn't all bad. And there might be some good things that can come out of this. No tax on overtime, no tax on tips. I mean, that's great stuff, isn't it? I mean, who thinks that's a bad idea? I think that's a great idea. Any reduction in taxes is good. And I know there's a lot of Democrats out there who say corporations need to pay their fair share. And the idea that we're going to drop the corporate tax rate all the way down to 15% bothers a lot of them. You have to look at the corporate tax the same way you look at tariffs and understand that a reduction in the corporate tax rate is a reduction in the cost of producing and distributing goods and services. That's it. That is a pass-through expense. Nobody wants corporations to pay more for electricity or more for gas or more for, facilities management. Nobody wants their expenses to go up, because in every avenue except for taxation, we understand that if things get more expensive for business, things get more expensive for us. But it seems like on the Democrat side of the argument is that corporate taxes somehow don't have that same effect. That is a pass-through expense. You pay for the taxes. You pay for it through less goods and services. You pay for it through higher prices. We want to free up the economy. We want more competition. So there's some good things. If RFK goes in there, we do a good job and we steadily implement policies that make our food cleaner and we give enough runway. First, it starts with education. We have to make Americans smarter about the choices they're making, about the foods that they're buying. Okay. And then at the same time, we have to say, we're also going to make our food supply safer by implementing these policies over this period of time so that prices don't automatically skyrocket or we automatically immediately have some shortages of supply in the food chain, so that we're implementing this in a smart, deliberate manner. But it's absolutely something that needs to be done. Furthermore, his stance on big pharma and the chronic disease epidemic in this country, which, this isn't a conspiracy. There's a financial incentive for people to be sick. big pharma profits off of people being sick. It's not a, it's a lot easier to treat it. It's much more profitable to treat it than to cure it. And it's even more profitable to, or it's even less profitable to prevent it. Preventative, we don't do enough preventative care in this country. We don't focus enough on prevention. And I hope that RFK gets in there and changes that too. I hope we can make that kind of progress over the next 4 years. If he implements these things right and he surrounds himself by the right people, I think that he wins in an even bigger landslide. Well, he won't run again, but I think, whether it's Vance or Vivek Ramaswamy or whoever the Trump successor will be on the Republican ticket, would win in a landslide, because I think most Americans will see that as, look, we're better off now than we were 4 years ago. So that's kind of my take on this election, on what we're doing moving forward, and what my hopes are for what the country is going to look like over the course of the next 4 years. But the thing to watch right now is cabinet appointments. Who is he surrounding himself with? I think that I read something about Thomas Massey potentially being tagged for a cabinet position. I think USDA or agriculture or something like that. I think that's a great move. I'd love to see Rand Paul play some kind of a role in a foreign policy type position. He's not going to be Secretary of State. Him and Paul don't get along great, but there's even talks of Ron Paul and Elon Musk working together in some kind of government, Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which I think is hilarious. Those are good things. Those would be good things if they came to fruition. Will they? I don't know. But the chatter is good. I looked at him in who he was appointing in 2016, and it was the same people. It was the swamp was who he appointed to his cabinet. And so the question is, has he learned from that? Is he going to avoid it this time around? And I think if he does, there's actually room for people on both sides to have, you can hate a bunch of stuff about him, but I think there's room for people on both sides of the aisle to have some level of optimism, at least in some policy positions, with a Trump presidency. So that's my hope. The other thing is I guess I look at the legal troubles. This probably tick people off. I'm not a big believer in the E. Jean Carroll case. Sorry. I'm just an evil misogynist. 35 years, there's no physical evidence, civil case. We had to suspend the statute of limitations. I just don't, I have a problem with it. I don't put a lot of stock in it. I think the New York case, the fraud case in New York is, and I think most people understand at this point that was an absolutely ridiculous political stunt, a witch hunt. There was no complaint from the people he was doing business with. This is an attorney general just trying to make a name. So I don't put a lot of faith in that. I guess I don't put a lot of faith in his, not faith isn't the right word. I don't put a lot of stock in his quote unquote legal woes and his legal troubles, just because there's enough stuff there where it's like, well, this was obviously it was a weaponization. I think there was some lawfare there. And like I said, I didn't vote for him this time. I've never voted for Donald Trump. I lean to the right. I don't think he's some kind of conservative small government savior. I just look at the cases on their merit and I go, what in the world is going on here? It just doesn't make any sense. So from that perspective, I don't put a lot of weight in that. I think I know a lot of people do. He's found guilty in the civil, or found liable in the civil case, and they're just like, he did this thing. I don't know. The hush money case, I'm like, it's an NDA. It's a cash agreement with an NDA. The hush money case, they call it the hush money case. It's basically just an NDA, which is not an uncommon thing to pay somebody. Here's a non-disclosure agreement. We're going to settle this. I don't want you to talk about it. Here's some money. I think that's more about where the money came from, and that's almost an accounting error. I don't know. I didn't research the cases a ton. Maybe if I did, my opinion on them would change. If someone wants to throw some links in the comments, I'd be more than happy to follow them and take a look at them. But I think that, I wanted to, after it cooled off for a few days, I did enjoy watching the journalists eat crow. That's always fun. Sorry, they're super. They're super biased. It's incredibly obvious to anybody who's paying attention. There's no journalistic integrity anymore, and so it was fun watching them eat crow. I enjoyed that. When you have a journalist who's supposed to be objective, crying or having trouble holding back tears because a political candidate lost an election, you know that you're not listening to somebody who's giving you unbiased, objective information. And, of course, the View and all that stuff. So it's really fun watching those people kind of eat crow. I enjoyed it in 2016. I think I even enjoyed it even more now. It's kind of funny. I think that so many people expected this to be a tight race. If I'm not mistaken, I feel like the Democrats have to poll higher because less Republicans typically respond. So if the Democrats and the Republican are polling super tight, it's going to lean Republican because less Republicans respond. Democrats tend to get oversampled. They said they fixed the polling. That was obviously a lie. First president to win the popular vote and first Republican to win a popular vote in over 20 years. This was and I like the people coming out saying wasn't a mandate. He won in a little place. Stephen A. Smith has got this right. It was a shellacking. She got her butt kicked. And I think the big thing is the thing that impresses me the most, or the thing that I think speaks the loudest to me about Trump's victory, is the gains he made in blue areas, the gains he made in Jersey, the gains he made even in California, the gains he made in places in Democrat strongholds. If he has a good 4 years, if he has a good 4-year presidency and we have a strong economy, and let's say Russia and Ukraine ends and we get some kind of a peace agreement in the Middle East and things are quiet for the next 4 years, people are going to remember the Ukraine war. People are going to remember Hamas. People are going to remember what went on. And if the economy is strong and real, so let's just be perfectly clear. You can bring grocery prices down. So inflation is a constant. Things are, we live in our monetary theory our monetary policy is an inflation-based policy. We want 2.5% to 3% inflation every year. That's what we want. Prices overall in the CPI aren't going to come down, but certainly you can make energy and groceries come down with good policy. And if that happens, and we continue to have low unemployment, and we have a strong economy, and crime rates fall, and all these different things, I don't know that there's a road back for the Democrats in the short term. From what I'm watching, from what I'm seeing from the talking heads, is they are absolutely doubling down on all of it. This is misogyny. This is racism. And I'm just like, I don't know if that's first, I don't believe that to be true. Kamala was at a disadvantage with the short race. The Democrats botched the handoff from Biden to Kamala, and you could lay some of the blame of that at Joe Biden's feet, so on and so forth. 100%, certainly. Would Kamala have won? Would Kamala have been the candidate in an open primary? I don't think so. But given everything that's happened over the last 4 years, I don't know that a Democrat was going to beat Donald Trump. I don't know who. It's not going to be Gavin Newsom. I know a lot of people talk about Gavin. It's never going to be Gavin Newsom. They don't want to expose California. He's talking about Trump proofing California. And I'm just like, okay, my guy, nobody wants California exposed to a national race. No Democrat wants, I don't think any Democrats want Gavin Newsom. And when I say Democrats, I don't mean Democrat voters. I mean Democrat power structure wants what happened in California to come under the scrutiny of a presidential race. No, it's not going to be Gavin Newsom. And I just don't know who you have on that side of the aisle right now. When I look at this victory and the scale of it, who on that side is an up and coming star that is going to beat a Vivek Ramaswamy should he run, or a JD Vance, or who's the other one? There's another one, younger up and coming Republican. I can't remember. I can't think. Yeah, the name escapes me right now. Who's going to show up and beat them? It's Gretchen Whitmer. I mean, come on, really? Oh, look, I'll tell you this: a ticket with a Republican, with a JD Vance and a Vivek Ramaswamy with Tulsi Gabbard as vice president. Who's beating that ticket into 2028 unless things go really bad over the next 4 years? And I don't think you can root for things to go bad. And I think that Trump has some good economic ideas. And I think some of the other things that if they are implemented properly could be very beneficial to the American people and to the American consumer. And based on his foreign policy record from his first term, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if this means this is, I think that every time there's a big victory like this, we like to talk about that's the death knell of the Democrat Party and so on and so forth. No, it's not. I think they said that after Obama won. This is it. This is the end of the Republican Party. It took a while, 2 terms of Obama, then you get Trump. But this feels like the beginning of 2 terms of Republican dominance. And if things go well in the first 2 years, watch out, because you're not getting the House and the Senate back either. It's going to be very interesting to see what he could do with the majority in both chambers of Congress, because this is put up or shut up time. You better get something done. So another thing to keep your eye on, not just the cabinet races, but the other thing to keep your eye on is who becomes the Senate Majority Leader. Is it, and this is not a choice that Trump gets to make, but you'll be able to see the, I cannot see the chat on the YouTube channel. I don't know how to pull that up in this from OBS because I'm like an old man. But you'll, what am I going for here? What you'll see is you'll see what Republicans are resisting him. I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to keep an eye on. As who are the Republicans who are opposing him, because he is not necessarily particularly popular in his own party. So it's going to be very interesting to see as we look at who the Senate Majority Leader becomes. I think that from what I'm reading is the hope is that Rick Scott is the friendly choice, and he's the guy who is most opposed to kind of our current foreign policy and how we're doing things right now. So I'm interested in seeing how this Senate situation plays out as well, because I think that's going to play a big role in how cooperative are the Republicans going to be. Because you look at the Liz Cheneys and the Republicans who have stood against him after this victory, he's in a much stronger position to say, look, if you don't back me, I'll get you out in the midterms. So it's going to be interesting. So the things to keep an eye on, I'm going to reiterate before I sign off here. I'm trying to get to an hour. I'm not getting any likes. I think I'm doing a good job, but nobody's liking my live. Anyway, the thing that I would say is to keep an eye on is cabinet choices. Cabinet choices are going to be important. Please like the live. Cabinet choices are important. Who's going to win in the Senate? And what is the implementation of some of these policies? What is the implementation of some of these policies going to look like? And what kind of so here's one of the things. You got to watch for the trickeration, as I like to call it. Thank you for the likes. I appreciate it. You got to watch for the trickeration on the Republican side, because if you have active Republican opposition to Donald Trump's presidency, people who don't like him, people who are in bed with Big Pharma, people who are in bed with the military industrial complex, if you have that kind of opposition to Donald Trump, here's what happens. They'll start throwing legislation at him that is very popular with the Christian base. This is how you get Donald Trump. This is how you beat Donald Trump. If you are military industrial complex compromised, if you are Big Pharma compromised, if you are status quo compromised, and you view Donald Trump as the enemy, or that Donald Trump is going to hurt you, you start going Christian-based legislation. We want a national abortion ban. I think he's leaning too hard. I'll be honest with you. I think that he's leaning too hard into the transgender stuff. I don't think federal money should go to it. I agree with him on that. I don't think it should be allowed for minors. I don't think that's super controversial. But he's leaning a little too hard into it. Identity politics didn't win it for the Democrats. It's not going to win it for him. He needs to stick to foreign policy and economics. And if he does that and he does it well, he'll win. The Republicans will win again in 2028. But I see that in the Senate and in the House, opposition to Donald Trump from the Republicans would call them rhinos, whatever you want to call them, would throw legislation at him that we would have to veto that would make him incredibly unpopular with his base, or they will throw legislation at him that he'll have to veto or that he'll have to sign that will make him lose independents and moderates. So you got to watch. This stuff is all very nuanced. So you got to watch the legislation that comes out of Congress, stuff that's sponsored by Republicans who don't like Donald Trump, to put him in a position where he has to either oppose or sign legislation that's going to hurt him. So that's going to be a very, very interesting thing. Now, he's a pretty good communicator, despite what you may think. He's good at playing the media game. He's good at playing that. But I think if you're looking for something weird and underhanded to happen, the Democrats are the Democrats. They are who they are, and they're just going to oppose him kind of at every step of the way. But if you want to see him get hurt, if you look, like I said, you look at institutional Republicans who opposed him, like the Cheneys, and some of these other entrenched neoconservatives, man, just put a legislative slate in front of this guy that's going to make him come down on unpopular sides of issues that might make his base unhappy. Or that he may sign, like I said, that pushes moderates or independents back across the line, back to Democrats, just to get him out of office. This idea, so here's the thing, this idea that there is loyalty within the political parties, that there is loyalty, that there's loyalty in the Democratic or within the parties, if there's nothing but self-interest in the parties. So the idea that Republicans wouldn't scheme to hurt him is definitely not something there's definitely a strong possibility of that. This current Supreme Court, he may have more opportunity. Decision just called it. We got the House. We have 219. And I think that we saw that coming. Like I said, a friendly House and a friendly Senate. When we say friendly, I think friendly is a misnomer. You have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, but that doesn't mean that they're friendly to Donald Trump. There's a lot of entrenched neoconservative interests within the Republican Party who have a vested interest in him not being there. And I think that there's definitely a way that they can amend bills that he's going to want to sign that are going to have unpopular amendments with him that might hurt him with his base, and with moderates. And that's definitely a ploy. I think that these entrenched interests, look, I bring up the Cheneys. I know there's a bunch of Republicans, former national security advisors. Like when you look at who they are, these people don't care who's in the White House in regards to the party. They don't care if they lose the White House to a Democrat, if they're going to get a war hawk Democrat. Okay. They don't care. Yeah, exactly. In 2026, you get rid of the rhinos. Yeah. And so they don't care. They'll lose the White House if it protects them, if it protects the defense contractors, if it protects the big pharmaceuticals, if it protects them and and furthers their own interests. They don't care if there's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House. They care about their self-interests. Does that mean that Donald Trump doesn't care about his self-interest? Of course not. Everybody's self-interested. But in the I kind of look at it from like a long haul perspective. And I just think that there's going to be shenanigans. There's going to be shenanigans in Congress. Let's get for me, my priorities would be this. If I'm prioritizing what I want to get done, I want the corporate tax. I want the tax cut, corporate tax cut, extend the 2025 tax cuts. Okay. Get rid of the tax on overtime, get rid of the tax on tips. And then I want to see a reduction in, look, I would be giddy if we could get government spending back to pre-COVID levels. Let's just get government spending back to pre-COVID levels. Let's shave $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion off the government budget. This is what we were spending pre-COVID. If we could get spending back to that level, then the tax cuts aren't going to then we're going to be just fine. I don't know. I don't agree with the tariffs. I'm worried about mass deportation, but I do believe in secure borders. I hope that the Republicans don't go Handmaid's Tale on this thing. But I don't want I don't want a trade war with China. And I think that's more of an intimidation and a negotiation tactic than it is a real, oh, thanks for the diamonds, than a real policy position, that he's taking. So, I'm not super concerned about it. They did put some tariffs on China last time around. I think what we want is to, and I don't think the Chinese Communist Party I don't think China cares about I know China doesn't care about the suffering of their people. And so there's like this intimidation factor of like, we're going to have this trade war. China doesn't care if their people are angry at them. The Chinese government does not care if their people are angry at them. Trump has to keep his people happy with him. He has to win a re-election, or he has to, end his presidency on a strong enough note that he can get somebody elected to keep things going. So that worries me a little bit, because I think that if China were to really call his bluff on this, I don't know how great how well that would play out. And the goal of the tariffs, I think, is something that the Chinese government has been very resistant on, which is to get the Chinese to open their markets to the United States in a way that they haven't in the past. We've made inroads. We're doing more business in China, certainly. But I think that the goal is to get China to open their markets. I don't think it's necessarily just to get China to stop dumping cheap goods into the United States, because I think that when you look at the manufacturing, so this is kind of the thing that a lot of voters think are incorrect on. We're not bringing most of the manufacturing jobs of China are not coming back to the United States. Not only do we not want those things, we don't want those things manufactured in the United States. We want them manufactured in China because we can get those things, because they'll be too expensive if we try and manufacture them in China. You're gonna the reason to get them out, if they came back, if you bring that manufacturing base back to the United States, it's going to be automated. These aren't going to be jobs. It's not job creation. Isn't bringing low level. Not all Chinese manufacturing is low level, but bringing low level manufacturing from a country like China back to the United States, those aren't jobs. Those are that's going to be robots and AI putting that stuff together. I had this debate when I was in Wisconsin. When I was running for Senate in Wisconsin, Foxconn was going on. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Foxconn, but Foxconn was this big deal that Scott Walker gave all this money to Foxconn to build this manufacturing plant in near Milwaukee, billions of dollars in tax breaks and all this different stuff. And during the whole campaign, I just kept telling people, I said, these aren't going to be jobs. They're not going to hit their jobs number. Do you think in 5 years, I said, my exact quote was, do you think we're going to be screwing these TVs together 10 years from now with human labor? I'm like, this plant's going to be automated. Foxconn had a long reputation before that of automating their plants. The idea that tariffs are going to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States is incorrect. So the real goal here is to open the Chinese with these tariffs, with this threat of tariffs, is to open the Chinese market to American goods, not to bring low-level manufacturing jobs back from China. It's just not going to happen. The goods would be virtually unaffordable if we started manufacturing them here, by and large, and those goods are going to be manufactured through an automated process. It's not going to be like workers in a factory. It's just not going to happen. We've moved past that part of our economic development where low-level manufacturing is going to be a major source of employment in the United States. It's just not the case. So thanks for the postcard. So it's just not what's going to happen. So I think there's but again, this is like 3D chess or whatever, chess versus checkers, whatever you want to call it. The tariffs serve the purpose of trying to get the Chinese to bend on some other stuff, both from a strategic perspective in the South China Sea and from getting greater access to the Chinese markets. I think that's the negotiation you'll end up with the Chinese. That's my guess. That's my take of what he's actually trying to do there. Yeah, that's my view of it. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Very, very likely that I don't, but that just seems to be the thing that makes the most sense to me. I don't think he wants a trade war with China, but I do think that the Russia, here's the other thing that's going to be very unpopular, and the media is going to skewer him for this. So get yourselves ready for it. he is going to make a deal with Russia, and Ukraine is going to give up some land. There's going to be territory given up, and everybody's going to blame Trump for that. And the media is going to skewer him for pacifying Russia. And they're going to make comparisons to what happened with Chamberlain and Germany back pre-World War II, as if we're in the same geopolitical situation we were in there, as if we don't have multiple nuclear powers facing off against each other, as if it's the same. It's not even remotely close to a similar geopolitical situation as then. But those are the comparisons they're going to draw, and they're going to skewer him for making concessions to Russia. At the end of the day, he has not committed to saying that Ukraine's not going to lose any territory. They're absolutely going to lose territory to end this war. Period. That I see that happening 100%. The other major geopolitical challenge that I see is that is the situation with Iran, and what's going on with Israel. That's going to be a lot harder to unwind than what is going on in Russia. Getting Netanyahu's off the chain. He's off the leash. He can't turn his back on Israel without completely losing his base. So I don't know how exactly he's going to wind that down, and how he's going to make. I don't know how we get out of that, but that's why I'm not president of the United States, and I'm sitting here doing a stupid podcast instead of running for any significant office. I don't know how he unwinds that. I do believe that Hamas probably doesn't launch that attack. I agree with the Republicans on this, Republican talking heads on this, where had we not botched the withdrawal from Afghanistan and shown ourselves to be weak, that attack maybe doesn't happen. But unwinding it is a different thing. It's just a ceasefire. I mean, and I know Hamas is already saying they want a ceasefire, so that's a good sign. I know the Houthis are already backing down from their aggressive position, so that's a good sign. It can end tomorrow if Israel says we're done, obviously. But I don't know what the peace deal, what that peace deal looks like in regards to, you can't leave Hamas. I don't think you've gone too far to leave Hamas in place. So I don't know how we extricate that situation, how we make that right. That's going to be a real challenge for his presidency. But if he pulls it off, and he gets us, and he stops the war in the Ukraine, and we have a prosperous economy, it's 4 more years of Republicans for sure at the end of his race. And I know I'm calling that a bit early, but that's just the way I see it. Hey, I want to thank Mayhem in my over here for sticking around so long. DJ83, thanks for the diamonds. I appreciate it. Thanks for all the likes. Also greatly appreciated. For those of you who hung around with me on YouTube, I cannot see my chat here. I still have to get that figured out. But I certainly appreciate you guys sticking around and listening in. I'm going to try and do more of these. I'm actually leaving the country for a couple of weeks, so I won't be doing any lives, but I'm going to try and do more lives this week, just to get a little mojo going. I'm definitely going to create content while I'm over there. And I'm going to get some, hopefully I'll get some German perspective on the election. Maybe get some firsthand stuff I can share with you folks. So if you don't follow me, please do so. Like the content, obviously. Follow me if you're not, especially over there on YouTube, by the way. But if one of you follows me, you could potentially be my 300th follower, which is, hey, look at me. So, and to those of you here on TikTok, I appreciate it. I'm going to be ducking out for the night, and